Hello, everyone. My name is Ade Jarkeb Babington Ashaye. Along with Jared Wong and Richie Gill, we co-chair the 2020 annual meeting of the American Society of International Law. On behalf of the Society, we're delighted to welcome you to the second of two late-breaking panels on the COVID-19 pandemic. These sessions offer a sneak peek into the Society's first ever virtual annual meeting, which will be held next week on the 25th and the 26th of June. The annual meeting will feature over 150 speakers drawn from every corner of the international community to share remarks, thoughts, and ways forward in line with this year's theme, the promise of international law. Today's panel is co-sponsored by Basel, Blacks of ASIL, and will address the disparate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on minorities and marginalized communities against the backdrop of race relations and police brutality. In these challenging times, we need international law to step up and live up to its promise, and for the international community to reckon with broken promises. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Catherine Powell. Catherine is a professor of law at Fordham Law School. She's also an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. She was recently appointed as co-chair of Basel by the president of ASIL. Professor Powell coined the terms color of COVID and gender of COVID in recent op-eds published on CNN and Think Global Health. We're extremely lucky to have her as the moderator, together with a stellar panel of experts. A final point, the session is being recorded and will be available on the annual meeting page afterwards. Also, please do post your questions in the Q&A box, which is right by the screen. I look forward to a very interesting discussion, and over to you, Professor Powell.
Thank you so much, Joke. And I want to thank the other ASIL program chairs and committee. Wes, Ben, the whole ASIL team has been phenomenal. I want to also respectfully acknowledge the traditional and sacred lands on which we sit, particularly of the Lenape people of New York, where many of us work. I want to honor and acknowledge that we each play a role in working toward the reconciliation and dissembling systems of oppression everywhere. New York is home to many indigenous peoples, and we're grateful for the opportunity to learn and work on this land. As Joke said, I'm the incoming chair of Basel, and it's with great honor that we co-host this panel with ASIL. We have an all-star lineup, and I want to introduce our panelists. We have Mityange Sirleaf, who is just starting a new position at University of Maryland Law School. Amanda Klasing, the acting co-director of Human Rights Watch Women's Rights Division. And then we have Tendai Achiome, who's professor of law at UCLA, the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, and faculty director of the UCLA Promise Center Institute for Human Rights. I don't know what she does in her free time. Let me say that our format is going to be interactive. We want to engage with the audience. I'm going to ask a series of questions for our panelists, and then after a few of these questions, we will go to audience questions. Let me just start for framing purposes by saying we're at a moment. We're at an inflection point. We're in a moment of interlocking pandemics, not only a health pandemic, but a pandemic of police violence, of poverty, and of protest worldwide. George Floyd and Eric Garner were arrested for crimes of poverty. We live in a time of record-breaking unemployment caused by the health crisis, a crisis that has unmasked various forms of structural inequality. Let me start with an initial round of questions around the problems and challenges we face. And I'll turn first to Professor Sirleaf to ask you about how this current moment concerning COVID-19 and the focus on police violence have highlighted various human rights violations, particularly affecting marginalized communities. And Professor Sirleaf, if you can start us off by offering some insights on how the global health landscape, both currently and historically, reveals how health interventions have been racialized. Let me turn to you first.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Catherine. So I want to actually start by just trying to contextualize the current moment with COVID-19 and how it's revealing the underlying racial hierarchy globally, but strikingly in the United States. And we see this in the current disparities with COVID-19. The disease is disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities. A recent study from the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies reveals that racial disparities are even worse than the preliminary data indicated. The results show that Black and Latinx individuals that have COVID-19 have mortality rates that are almost 9 times higher than white people in the United States when you take age into account. The prior data that was released did not take age into account. And so this study indicates extremely high ratios of mortality. For example, between the 25 and 54 year Black, which is more than 3 times when you take into account the amount of the mortality rate for white people who are suffering from COVID-19. And that is despite the fact that white people in the United States make up a significantly larger portion of the population than Black or Latinx communities do. And so I want to contextualize these glaring health disparities against some of sort of the common explanations for this, which is usually pointing to comorbidities or pre-existing health conditions like hypertension or diabetes and the like that Black people and other people of color are disproportionately affected by. And I want to complicate that understanding of why we see COVID-19 presenting so much in these communities, because it's implausible that one racial group of people have a genetic predisposition to asthma or to diabetes or to heart failure and the like. And so instead of there being something pathological about Black and Brown and other people's colors sort of constitution or genetics, it's more that the ways society has been historically organized and continues to be organized is one that is deadly for people of color. And so we see this present in COVID-19 and how this is impacting the health incomes and the structural conditions in which Black and Brown and other communities live really have detrimental impact on their health outcomes. And these structural factors present, I think, a more compelling answer for thinking through why we see these disparities showing up. And so that includes everything from inaccessible or biased healthcare providers, inadequate support systems from schools to educations, to living in violent and polluted communities, to de facto segregation, to hazardous unemployment. And this is particularly striking when we think about who are deemed the quote unquote essential workers in society today, which is, again, exposing the underlying racial hierarchy where stay-at-home orders presume that you have the privilege and you have the ability to maintain social distancing. But for many people of color, that is just a luxury that they do not have. They might live in crowded dwellings in densely populated areas, all of which impact their risk of exposure. And so the ability to follow social distancing guidelines is not really possible. And then you have structural conditions like lack of paid sick days or adequate health insurance, which are complicating the lives of the grocery store workers, convenience workers, drugstore workers, transportation workers, and the like, who are on the front line. And so at the same time that you have this severe racial disparity in the impact of COVID-19, you also have the racialization of COVID-19, which is tied to historical patterns of racializing people of color as diseased, sort of fundamentally. And this is tied to a long history of the ways in which people of color have been treated. And so COVID-19 sort of unearths this, not only for Black and Brown communities, but for Asian communities. With COVID-19, there has been resurfacing of yellow peril, which is the 19th century school of thought that everything emanating from Asia was a threat to the Western world and the Western order. And so a lot of the anti-Asian sentiment that has been presented with COVID-19 is tied to these historical linkages between thinking of people of color as sort of diseased as a matter of constitution. And then this relates to the development of the global health regime in really important ways. And so I want to talk about that and also talk about the ways in which certain diseases become racialized depending on the populations that are impacted or disproportionately impacted, whereas others are not. So we've seen this, for example, with H1N1 in 2009, a disease that emerged in the United States, but many tried to identify sort of a foreign source for that disease, and blaming Mexican quote unquote illegals for bringing the virus across the border, whereas when the mad cow disease was spreading from the United Kingdom, we didn't see the similar racialization of diseases. And so this racial fear of contagion is related to how the global health regime emerged. The emergence of this regime was coterminous with European imperial expansion. Colonial powers actually increased international cooperation during a time of expanding empire and trade, and the containment of diseases was necessary for the expansion of empire. And so we see this in the reflection of all of the early treaties that were enacted to perfect the global health regime. As early as 1851, there were attempts to create an international treaty to try to prevent diseases and control them, but particularly control them from reaching the metropole and the colonial center. And so the early instantiation of the global health regime was to control diseases from coming from racialized territories and to protect the center at the expense of the periphery. And I say that intentionally because at the same time that British colonials, say, for example, in 1793, were giving Lenape emissaries items from a smallpox infirmary to intentionally spread diseases to nearby indigenous people, they were also engaged in a settler colonial project, which decimated numerous Native and indigenous populations, but they were simultaneously formulating treaties to protect themselves from whatever diseases might be emanating from the so-called world. And so understanding the global health against this bound, race is a key factor in its development. The first International Sanitary Conference was convened, and that really just focused on cholera by way of example, because cholera at that time was a huge threat to European powers at that time. And so the entire treaty only addresses cholera, whereas, of course, there were other diseases that were impacting communities across the world. And so I will just use that as an example to illustrate that the ways in which diseases become prioritized internationally depended on how they intersected with the priorities of Western capitals. And this is reflected in all of the early global health treaties. And indeed, it's not until the 1944 modification of the International Sanitary Convention that you see an attempt in the global health regime to require states to send information about any disease, irrespective of whether they had been preordained by Western powers as significant. And so with the most recent instantiation of the National Health Regulations of 2005, this is the widest sort of attempt to surveil states for and require states to notify them of infectious diseases. And even in the new World Health Organization and the International Health Regulations of 2005, there is still a way in which race plays a determining role, or an influential role in determining what counts as a public health emergency of international concern. And so that in and of itself is a decision that's informed, if not explicitly, certainly implicitly, by determination of the worth or utility of the populations that are impacted by that particular disease. And we've seen that with the 2014 Ebola epidemic, wherein it took the disease touching and concerning the United States with very few cases, and Europe with very few cases, before we could see a disease which had been ravaging numerous countries in the West African subregion being declared as a public health emergency of international concern. And so in coming now and then to COVID-19, we see sort of similar patterns of racialized fears of contagion that are influencing the prioritization of this particular disease, resurfacing of fears about yellow alert and the like, Asian communities or people who present as Asian being targeted across the globe and being racially profiled as if the disease is consonant with being Asian. And then there's also been this attempt to sort of normalize xenophobia and racism as sort of understandable reactions to COVID-19, which is a problematic way of mapping diseases onto racial bodies and onto certain countries and the progeny that's happening at the global and national level.
Thank you so much, Mitangye. That was an incredible overview of the racialization of disease, as well as looking at the various ways in which COVID unmasks structural inequality. As I pivot to Amanda, I've also written about the what I call the racial justice paradox of how people of color are both overrepresented in unemployment, job loss over these last couple weeks, months, as well as in essential work, particularly blue-collar work, warehouse workers, delivery, bus drivers, and healthcare. The same is true in terms of gender, and there's a gender justice paradox as well, where women are overrepresented in the unemployment numbers and in essential work, including healthcare. Amanda, let me turn to you so you can help us understand more about how COVID has impacted women and bring an intersectional lens to this.
Great, thanks so much. We know that crisis disproportionately impacts women or impacts women distinctly. If you look at the Ebola epidemic, if you look at Zika, the research that Human Rights Watch did showed that both women as healthcare workers, but women as caregivers and women who are disproportionately impacted are not always a part of the solution or are sometimes left out of planning for a response. We also know that in crisis, whether it's humanitarian or war, there's evidence of gender-based violence increasing, that access to decision-making, access to reproductive rights are impacted and curtailed. So going into the pandemic, we could identify real concerns that we had, including women's economic and workplace impacts, sexual and reproductive health and rights, girls' education, but how it's actually playing out in practice is even worse and more expansive than one could have projected. So, if you really think about the workplace, as you said, is there are 70% of healthcare workers globally are women. So when you think about essential workers, you're thinking about a gendered space. And there are many communities where 95% of the informal economy are women. So access to the recovery or the measures that governments are putting in place to ensure that there's some sort of social floor or social protection, women may not be able to access. Sex workers are left out of many of those as a part of the informal sector, but also housing precarity, women's land and property rights. If you can't, access courts right now, if there are increased pressures on home life and there might be gender-based violence at home, actually accessing and leveraging the court system in order to claim your own property rights, or widows might be left out of this process. So we're seeing that all of these spaces that we have been concerned about prior to the pandemic are really expanding the risk that women and girls will not come out of this pandemic, not only in a recovery effort that is equitable, but they will actually lose so much of the gains that we've made in the economy over the last several decades. You look at, children are not in school, and if children aren't in school, women aren't in the workplace in many places. When the workplace is the home, sexual harassment and gender-based violence becomes this complicated space where how do you police and ensure that that sexual harassment is not happening in the workplace when the employer is kind of virtually in the space. So we're really problematizing a lot of these concerns that we, prior to this, had certainly not solved. And moving into sexual and reproductive health and rights, already access was a challenge for many women and girls globally, both to contraception, to prenatal care, to abortion services. But governments have used this opportunity of lockdown to actually further restrict access to abortion services, claiming it's not an essential health service. Women have had difficulty in accessing prenatal care, and birth attendants, which we know are an important component of reducing obstetric violence, have actually not been able to go into maternity wards. But we also don't have a good sense of what's happening with pregnant women and COVID because disaggregated data and access to data around maternal mortality and morbidity hasn't necessarily been overlaid with COVID testing. There wasn't a real clarity on how pregnant women may be disproportionately impacted. We just saw a study coming out of Spain that, in fact, there might be preterm or other types of preeclampsia similar symptoms, but because oftentimes pregnant women are not a part of the overall narrative of kind of testing or mandatory reporting, it can be challenging to get to that data, especially when a lot of the prenatal care is difficult to access at this time. And then there's a narrative that's going very strongly that gender-based violence has increased. One of the challenges is that the traditional methods for us to be able to monitor whether or not gender-based violence has increased is through reporting. And so if the reporting chains and the mechanisms by which governments monitor cases of gender-based violence have changed, then it's really difficult to understand exactly what is happening in the home and whether or not there are interventions that are working or not working. Oftentimes it's the public health system or private health clinics that provide women's health care that are the first line of monitoring and accessing services for victims of sexual violence or domestic violence. And when those are shut down, then having the correct referral mechanism is quite a challenge. All of this becomes more complicated when you think about all of these impacts don't hit all women in the same way. And so, thinking about Black, Indigenous, and women of color, particularly in the United States, but you look throughout the Americas, you look throughout globally, already there was a disproportionate impact on these communities. If you think about in the United States, Black women are 3 times as likely to die preventable maternal deaths. They're nearly twice as likely to die from preventable cervical cancer. These are elements of state neglect and really demonstrate how difficult it is already to access a healthcare system that was not really built to serve on an equitable basis. When you think about refugee and migrant women, both looking in the context of refugee settings, already very difficult to access reproductive health services, safety protection services, this is going to become even more difficult. We have evidence in Greece of how difficult the conditions are for refugee women. Women that are migrant domestic workers, again, when the workplace is the home and we're really losing out on visibility of what's happening in the home, and domestic workers have increased risks and increased workloads when you're thinking about children at home and not in school, the need to sanitize spaces, to keep the hygiene requirements have increased. And so whether or not the protections that have been gained over the last few years through international treaties and domestic laws to provide more rights to domestic workers, it's difficult to know whether or not those are holding under this current context. And then women with disabilities and older women, already a part of the population where we don't have good visibility, that we don't really have good statistics, particularly older women. What is happening in this time where you have multiple levels of violence that can happen, both intimate partner violence from family members. There's increased risk for this group, and yet the data on it is on this population is really, really challenging. But and of course, I had mentioned sex workers before, but there are other criminalized populations that are of particular risk, including LGBTQ women globally. But I think this is a moment, we talked about the promise of international law, and this as being a moment, and I think it's a real moment to consider whether or not the criminal justice system, which is so much where the response to gender-based violence has sat, that there's so much policing of women and girls' bodies that are connected to the criminal justice system. And it is so entirely clear that it is not the appropriate mechanism by which to both advance public health or advance issues related to ending gender-based violence. And yet the police are being used in countries around the world, militarization of police, to actually enforce the mechanisms by which lockdowns are put in place, police the homeless, or those without housing, and to increase policing in communities that are already at risk from the pandemic. And so this is a moment to really look to the other components of the promise of international law, which is that we already, through a human rights mechanism, are in the possibility of looking comprehensively at human rights, looking at the interrelatedness and interdependence of rights, including economic and social rights with civil and political. So really trying to leverage that in a space that addresses these intersecting and many ways that that women are being disproportionately impacted.
Terrific. Okay, that sounds like a very good bridge to Tendai. And Tendai, I want to ask you about the impact of these interlinking crises of COVID, of police violence on the global racism debate.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks to the ASIL team for doing an amazing job under extraordinary circumstances. And thanks also to my co-panelists who are phenomenal and from whom I feel like I've learned a lot, even just on this on this webinar. So what I want to do is offer some reflections from the perspective of my mandate. And there's just been enough going on that some of the thoughts may seem a little bit scattered, but they are connected. I want to it's helpful to go after both of our previous panelists, because the dynamics that they are describing both nationally and transnationally are ones that I can say from the reports that I received from my mandate are confirmed and echoed. And so what we've seen in the pandemic seems to be a rise in xenophobic and racist attacks in the context of the pandemic. And this has happened even in societies, I think, that struggle to understand themselves as racialized societies. And so I was in another conversation with actually a researcher from Human Rights Watch who is of Asian descent and lives in Sweden, and was talking about how attacks against people of Asian descent in Sweden during the pandemic had escalated and were forcing a conversation in that country about race in a way that had been difficult prior to that. And so even in societies that don't understand themselves as racialized, the pandemic, I think, has been forcing conversations that otherwise might not have happened. Another dynamic that I think is worth highlighting is that we've seen in the context of this pandemic how ethno-nationalist rhetoric and politics can very much be at the center of public health disasters and can drive public health disasters that affect disproportionately those communities, but also the broader public as well. And so one thing we are seeing is yet another one of the costs of having had a rise in ethno-nationalist governments and discourse around the world, and the kind of disinformation that is spreading via social media and other platforms on who can get COVID-19, who is immune. And this is tied to, I think, some of the histories and presence that Matiangi was speaking about. It's even clearer now why we can't think that ethno-nationalism is only a fringe problem. It's one that's affecting very fundamental structures, and fundamental structures that kind of are supposed to undergird liberal institutions. So that's been terrifying to bear witness to. And then if we step back a little bit from individualized attacks, xenophobic attacks, or racist attacks, one of the things I think we're seeing globally is just a kind of manifestation of the meaning of race as a structure, right? A structure of disadvantage. And this having to confront the meaning of race in this way, I think I'll come back to this in the context of the debates we've been having around systemic racism and law enforcement, including in the Human Rights Council. So one of the things that I've experienced as special rapporteur since I started in 2017, and that seemed to me to be the case even in my own academic work, is that the global discourse on racism, and when I say global discourse, I mean the discourse within the UN and the discourse that is most strongly adhered to even by the globally influential human rights organizations, has not really taken seriously what it would mean to undo structures of racism. So where racism and xenophobia come up, it's the focus tends to be on acts of explicit violence or explicit racism. And in the beginning of the pandemic, we were seeing that. But because of how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted racial and ethnic minorities, even in communities where they understand themselves to not have explicit animus against those groups, it's forcing conversations about, again, as I mentioned, race as a structure. And then I think the response to the pandemic has itself is worth marking, and the racialized dynamics of the response to the pandemic nationally and globally is something to focus on. So in this country, we saw protests against pandemic measures that came from the right and to which the government responded in far more lenient ways than when we saw the protests that happened in the context of the killing of George Floyd and others who have died. And I think that racialized response to different kinds of protest was catalytic, and I'll speak to catalytic of what in a moment. And then even outside, and then within this country as well, there were reports of, Black and brown people being disproportionately subject to police engagement over whether or not they were wearing masks, how they were social distancing, and there were images appearing of groups of predominantly white people where law enforcement was just not engaging in those ways. I want to connect that with the racialized nature of pandemic enforcement in other parts of the world, because that has been happening as well. And so in some cases, it's been, the kinds of things that are consonant with the kinds of reports I receive in my mandate. So reports that Roma communities in parts of Western and Eastern Europe were being disproportionately targeted for pandemic measure enforcement, shelter in place, lockdown, on an ethnic basis rather than any kind of real investigation as to what the public health threats were, and further securitization of those communities under the pretext of the pandemic. And this is a dynamic that has confronted refugees and asylum seekers in different parts of the world as well. But then even just, racial profiling and enforcement of pandemic measures in France, for example, which got so intense that they contributed to sparking some of the national uprising that has also been taking place in that country in opposition to systemic racism. So the pandemic response as well, and the fact that everybody, I think, was at home under very tense conditions, I think played a catalytic role in delivering to us the world that we are now in, which is one where I would characterize it as kind of national and a transnational uprising against systemic racism. And the most crystallized front of that is in the context of law enforcement. But any of you who've been to protests or any of you who've been watching will see that it's not just in law enforcement. In many parts of the world, the debate or the protests are against just a need for recognition and engagement with systemic racism. So, I think one thing ultimately what I'm trying to say is, one, we've had greater visibility of issues to do with racism and xenophobia, including in places that tend to deny the existence of those dynamics. And then I'm also marking a shift in the nature of the discourse. So rather than focusing on individualized acts of prejudice, greater attention to systems and structures that are racist and that can result in, the dead bodies that we see here in the United States, and having groups like the UN Human Rights Council, different UN actors, and even, national leaders, not of this country, but of other countries, kind of coming out and saying that, yes, systemic racism may be a problem. That shift in discourse is one that is remarkable in the sense that it's worth marking. And I think the question now is whether there's going to be a shift in action. And I can talk a little bit more about this later when we talk about the urgent session. The final thing I do want to say is that a lot of the reason why I think the global conversation around racism has become as sophisticated as it's become in this moment, and that's how I would describe it, like an increase in the sophistication of global conversations around race, has been the tireless work that movements have been doing. So movements in this country, like Black Lives Matter, which is now a transnational movement and has been a transnational movement for many years now. movements have been working really hard to name systemic racism and also to name concrete alternatives, right? So we are now in this country having people who I never thought I'd see the words defund the police, kind of coming out of their mouth, and not as a, future pie in the sky idea, but as a concrete step that is being taken as a step towards racial justice. That debt we owe, I think, to movement actors who for a very long time have been doing the work, not just of naming systemic racism, or of giving us pathways to how we get out of them. And so we need to mark the shift in discourse, and then I'll come back to whether we can say there's a concomitant shift in action as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so let me go to a second bucket of questions, which Tendai has already teed up, and that's the role of activism. And I want to ask a couple of questions here. I mean, one is this an Occupy Wall Street moment? Is it an Arab Spring moment? To what extent is this a pivot point? Occupy was more domestic. Arab Spring was, of course, regional. Many have been frustrated that the Arab Spring didn't lead to more lasting change. We're seeing a transnational human rights movement, as Tendai has just alluded to. She talked about the dichotomy between the response to those protesters in opposition to stay-at-home measures on the one hand, and then those protesting police violence on the other, and the different ways in which law enforcement responded. To take that out to a global level, we see protests, some in solidarity with the US, with Black Lives Matter, some in resistance to local, homegrown racism and police violence. And then, frankly, some opposition to US policies, to Trump, to the history of US imperialism. So there's a lot going on there. But I'd like to ask each of you to reflect on the role of activism in highlighting human rights violations. And then once we go through this round, the last round of questions, to just anticipate this, is government responses and the response of the UN and other international institutions. But let's just spend a few moments thinking about the role of activism initially, and does this signal a real pivot point? Mtiange, let me go back to you first.
Thanks for that, Catherine, and for Tendai and Amanda for your comments earlier. They were really generative and made me think about a number of things. And I want to tease out some more of what I see as sort of things that are tensions in the different types of protests we've seen, and also things that are particularly illuminating. And so I want to go back to thinking through how to make sense of the anti-lockdown protests that have happened in the United States to public health attempts to deal with COVID-19. And so it seems as though, as it became clearer and clearer that COVID-19 was not sort of the great universal leveler, that it was actually having really disproportionate impact racially, that the demand for an emphatic and corrective response became less and less, at least in some sectors of society. And so we saw anti-lockdown protests surface throughout the US in very disparate places. There are similar themes to these protests. The demonstrators are overwhelmingly white, all united in their vitriol against lockdown policies related to COVID-19. And so thinking about these stay-at-home measures as a perceived affront to impositions on liberty, impositions on the ability to consume when one wants to, as an infringement really on the entitlements of white privilege. The anti-lockdown protests are really sort of explicitly and implicitly making a judgment on whose lives are worth risking during the pandemic. And so thinking through sort of whiteness as property per Cheryl Harris is really instructive here, because historically the characteristic of being white was being the property of free human beings. And so lockdown measures, which threaten the very essence of some's perceived identity, some's perceived freedom and autonomy for some subset of white people, was a challenge to that racial order and to that racial hierarchy in ways in which people did not perceive themselves as being bound mutually to others, and that their movements shouldn't be restricted, their liberties shouldn't be restricted, and that it was unconscionable to think about doing so when apparently racial groups that were not associated with them were being the ones who were the most detrimentally impacted, right? I want a haircut. And so what is also telling is the presence of a number of symbols of racial terror and of subordination that came up at these protests, right? So it was not uncommon to see Confederate paraphernalia, to see nooses, to see even swastikas. And so that's what I mean by the protesters were explicitly making the connection between sort of a racial order, which positions white interests at the top as one that needed to be protected, and in which they saw the lockdown measures as challenging, right? So the social distancing laws and measures challenged this, and we actually have commentary from a Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin, Rebecca Bradley, mentions that the stay-at-home orders, she analogizes them to Japanese internment during World War II. And so this is quite striking because she's saying the quiet part out loud, because it's speaking to who is deserving of freedom and autonomy and who is supposed to be subject to restrictions on their freedom and autonomy within society. And so as the disease became more and more racialized or perceived socially as racialized, the decision to restrict the movement and freedom of others then was a challenge to that order. And so I want to contrast that to what we see happening now with the protest for racial justice, inequality, and the like, that have been inspired by the movement for Black Lives, and contrast the ways in which the state has responded to seeming challenges to the racial order, and those who are seeming to seek to uphold the racial order. So by that, I mean the incredible amount of restraint that law enforcement is apparently able to have in the face of people screaming in their face and the like, when you have the anti-lockdown protests happening. Whereas when there is the movement for to be respected as human beings and to not be killed, and to be allowed to breathe, you see the state responding with brutality, with armored vehicles, with curfews, with tear gas, with pepper spray, with rubber and wooden bullets. And this is illuminating because it shows what should be valued, or at least what society is deeming valuable. And what is also striking is in the face of, for example, the United States now, well over 100,000 deaths, over 2 million cases, not in any position where the rates of infection are under control, where there's sufficient tracing, where there's a testing capacity that has been ramped up. We have not seen a significant mobilization of resources to effectively deal with this pandemic by any stretch of the imagination in this country. However, when there was a threat to the perceived order, there was massive amounts of state and federal power and resources dedicated to quelling the protests, which continues to be dedicated to quelling the uprising. And it's illuminating to see how drastically different the state is responding in the midst of a pandemic to efforts to enforce the racial status quo, as opposed to ones that are challenging the hierarchy and what is valued within society. So I'll can go on, but I'll stop there.
So let me, because we're already getting a number of really great questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask Amanda and Tendai to respond to the same question, but also to relate that as well to how governments and international institutions are or should be responding. And I'll let Matiange come back around to you to respond to that as well. But Amanda, let me go to you next and ask you about the steps Human Rights Watch and other advocacy groups like Human Rights Watch are taking, and then also if you can link that to the role of governments and international organizations as well.
Great, thanks so much. I mean, I think that this moment is an accelerating moment for a number of things, and one of them being really centering the local, and the local in the sense that human rights are local and human rights movements are local. And a lot of the changes that need to happen in order to address some of these significant challenges are not at a national or federal level. They really are at the subnational level. And so in order to be allied with the movement, you have to really be looking and connecting directly to what is happening. And that's happening at a time where there's a real restriction in movement. And so traditional human rights methodologies where you can actually be in communication and interview people that are directly affected by human rights abuse, you're having to find other ways to provide that support. And so I think that this is really important time for INGOs in particular to elevate and highlight the work of local organizations and to really think through how to support that work and make that work as strong as possible. And I think, more broadly, this is also a moment where we can really see the interconnections between economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political rights. There has been this long history of an enforcement of these differences by the U.S. really in order to move forward a particular narrative. And what is entirely clear, both in the pandemic of the COVID pandemic and the pandemic of racism, is that you cannot have equality under law if you don't have substantive equality when it comes to economic and social rights issues. That these just can't be separated out because they don't, in fact, lead to the realization of human rights. And so I think that, as much as particularly, and I'm going to focus on the U.S. because I think this is a breaking of also the moment, an end of U.S. exceptionalism and its ability to control the narrative around human rights. And I think that there's going to be more and more of a push for recognition of economic and social rights. And that's going to come from organizations that are operating on the ground, that are seeing that water shutoffs because of failure to pay is connected to police violence, is connected to increased rates of COVID deaths in their community. I mean, they are seeing the interconnectedness of rights. And so they're going to demand that their rights be respected across the board. And so I think there's a real excitement in this opportunity to leverage human rights mechanisms, human rights, especially when we think about the exhaustion of domestic remedies, in a country that has never been repaired, has never really faced the need for reparations or remedy. Like, we are really having to go outside of the systems that were built by those that have continued to create the human rights harm. So I think, leveraging the mechanisms at the UN may just be the accountability and the catalyst for that sort of change. At least I hope so.
Tendai, can you talk about not only the role of protest, but the demand for the UN to hold an emergency session yesterday and debrief us on that?
Sorry, I committed the crime they told me that is the most common to commit on webinars. Okay, so I can do all of that, and you'll just have to cut me off if I keep going, because honestly, there is so much to be said on this topic. So just very quickly on the protests, a few things to note that I think resonate with both Matiangi and Amanda's insights. So one, I think there's an aspect to the protests outside of the US that is about solidarity, and solidarity with Black Americans who are confronted with fatal violence from the bodies that are supposed to be protecting them. And that solidarity, I think, speaks to how, even though you have systemic racism in law enforcement in many parts of the world, the kind of gun violence from law enforcement that this country has is remarkable and different from other parts of the world. So I think there are definitely countries where police violence and just the use of guns to kill people on a racial basis dominates. But I think, say, for much of Europe, that aspect of what's happening is stunning and shocking. And so just the solidarity that there are people who have to live under these circumstances is part of what's going on. Some of it is, I think, more than solidarity. It's coming from groups who understand themselves to be subject to US imperial power in ways that are racialized and in ways that mean that they identify, more than in solidarity, they identify with the kind of brutality of systemic racism in this country. And I think the Black Lives Matter mural in Syria, which we were discussing, Catherine, I think speaks to this, where people who've had to experience US imperial power in certain ways understand themselves to be subject to similar regimes. And then also people who've understood, who live under national governments that are so disconnected from them that you can have this kind of status quo, I think are also kind of coming out and speaking to that. And then I think with and I'm going to continue to talk about Europe, because Europe has been playing a very big role in what's happening in the urgent debate as well. But if you look at the protests in Europe against police violence, I think some of those have been pushing for greater reckoning within European countries with their colonial past. Whereas in the US, the history of slavery, I think very directly has delivered to us a kind of policing regime that is incubated in that universe. In Europe, what you see is that exploitation colonies were elsewhere, and there's just a kind of what I and others have talked about as a racial aphasia, an inability to even talk about race. There's many European countries, for example, that don't permit collection of disaggregated data on the basis of ethnicity and race, which even makes it harder to even know the scale of the problem. Amanda was mentioning the urgency of disaggregated data. And so the protests you see in Europe, I think, are pushing for a reckoning with those legacies in ways that is related to what's happening in the US, but I think is forcing domestic conversations that are parallel and that need to happen. And then now to kind of turn to the urgent debate in the Human Rights Council. And this is, it's a really extraordinary thing that this urgent debate is taking place. To think that the UN Human Rights Council is having a debate on systemic racism in law enforcement in the United States and other parts of the world, I would never have predicted that. And if anyone had said to me that would happen in 2020, I'd have laughed and said, in what universe would that happen? So I think that we even have this urgent debate speaks to the power of the movements that we've seen on the ground, right? We're seeing the largest transnational anti-racism movement maybe ever. I've been speaking to family members, grandparents who were alive during the anti-apartheid struggle and, the civil rights struggle. And what we're witnessing is truly remarkable. And I think it's for this reason that the African group within the Human Rights Council pushed to have this urgent debate in the first place. So a few things I want to say about the urgent debate, which I think is maybe the fifth one. So the Human Rights Council has had urgent debates in the past. It's not the first one that they've had, but the framing of it is interesting, right? So the title of it is the urgent debate on the current racially inspired human rights violations, systemic racism, police brutality, and the violence against peaceful protest. And I see this language as coming straight out of what's happening in the US. And the actual letter from the African group requesting the urgent debate refers to the death of George Floyd and the situation in the US, but definitely framed it as a need for a kind of a look globally at this issue of systemic racism in law enforcement and systemic racism against people of African descent. And I think both of those things have been important. And in my engagement with the council, I've made clear that both debates are urgent, a debate that focuses on the situation in the US and a debate that looks at these issues globally. So the urgent debate began yesterday and it continued today. And my understanding is that the latest I know, and this is from before I joined this call, is that there'll likely be a decision on a resolution on Friday. And I want to talk a little bit about the resolution, because the debate isn't just an opportunity to have a conversation, it's also an opportunity to take action. On the debate that took place yesterday, I was really disappointed with the tone of the debate. For those of you who may have watched it, to me, it felt like a commemoration of issues to do with systemic racism and a kind of just stepping back and looking at the ways we might approach racism within the UN, rather than a really forceful grappling with the lack of accountability for systemic racism and law enforcement that is resulting in dead bodies, right? And I think part of that has to do with the fact that since the urgent debate was scheduled, my understanding is that there has been pressure from the US government and its allies, and this is not anything I can confirm because no one has come to me and said these things with named sources, but the conversation as I'm hearing of it in Geneva is that there's been really serious pressure on governments that were supportive of a strong statement, in a way that means that the geopolitics that underlie the, systemic racism of the global order are permeating the way this urgent debate is taking place. And I think that's probably not really surprising. I want to talk very quickly about some of the proposals that people have put forward about what should come out of the urgent debate. George Floyd's family and the families of other people who've been killed in the US by police have asked the Human Rights Council to pursue a commission of inquiry into the situation in the US. And as Amanda was highlighting, I think that would be a really important and powerful and useful thing to happen, even from the perspective of the US. I think for people in the human rights world, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, commission of inquiry is coded as something that is reserved for a certain type of government. I'll talk more about that. But we really have to be understanding that one thing that is clear is that the domestic system has failed to provide accountability or even name as a harm so much of what people are protesting. And I wrote a piece on this, which talks about how the US is so far away from its international human rights obligations in this area that there could be real value to national and local actors to having an international commission of inquiry that would really elaborate what it would mean to make real human rights obligations in this space in the US. So that's been one request, is a request for a commission of inquiry focusing on the US. And then also there's been requests to have a systemic investigation of racism in law enforcement on a more global level. Now, that is seeming less likely, and I'll talk a little bit about what some of the opposition to Commission of Inquiry has been, or even opposition to the kind of resolution that I would mean we could expect meaningful action in this space. I think there's some opposition that I would describe as just, illiberal, for lack of a better word. So there may be actors who just don't think we should be worried about racism, but I would say that's a kind of fairly small universe, and I'm not even sure necessarily who populates it. Some of the kind of what I would think of as liberal articulations of why a commission of inquiry is not ideal in the US context. And this, I think, these kinds of arguments have been articulated at multiple levels. I think there's some government actors who have articulated these positions in informal dialogues that have been held in the context of this. And then I think there's even some human rights organizations that may have articulated versions of this. So one is the idea that the situation isn't grave enough. So commissions of inquiry are reserved for very serious human rights violations, and the human rights violations that we're talking about are not serious. And I have to be honest, it's a little bit terrifying to hear that sort of argument applied in this case, when I think we've seen that the harms have been egregious enough to mobilize the largest transnational uprising, against a type of harm, systemic racism, that the kind of the gravity concern, I think, misses not just how people are suffering, the deaths of Breonna Taylor, of, George Floyd, but it also misses the, I think, really powerful and unequivocal human rights critique that we are seeing in the streets. So the gravity arguments, I think, are not quite right. There's some people who argue that international commissions have to be reserved for governments that don't have the mechanisms to deal with the problem, to actually provide domestic accountability, right? So the sort of failed state or deeply compromised state machinery, and that's, we should be reserving them for those situations. And I think for the whole argument and the whole point of why people are out on the streets is to say that the domestic regime in the US and in other countries cannot even grapple with, and it's like the harms are not even legible in the regime. Not only have they been attempts at so-called reform, but many of the ills are actually legal, right? So the claim that the domestic regime can handle these challenges, I think, is belied by precisely the claims that are being made in the streets. Which brings me to my final point, and then I'll be quiet because I know we can have a really good Q&A. And it has to do with the theme of this annual meeting, which is the promise of international law. And I want to connect it to the work of Makau Matua, whose work I remember reading as a student in the human rights clinic. My clinic professor assigned that paper, and it was the first time I read it. And he has this article, which many of you may know, which introduces this idea of a kind of savages, victims, savior paradox. And for those of you who know Makamutu's work, he's a very powerful and kind of gripping writer. And I remember when I first read that article, I thought, okay, there's something powerful about this critique, but it might be overstated, right? And the short version of the critique is that within the kind of human rights regime, you have three sorts of metaphors that can help us understand the way it functions. There's the savage, which is like the state that engages in human rights violations and has to be brought, tamed by the regime. There's the victims, those who are subject to human rights violations and, who have to be saved by the saviors, right? So there's the saviors, there's the savages, and the victims. And his critique is a racial critique as well. He says that there's something about the regime that means that the savages and the victims are predominantly people from the global south, people of color, right? And then the saviors, or the role of saviors, is maintained for liberal, quote unquote, liberal orders or liberal actors, and that there is a kind of a whiteness that attaches to that. What I see playing out in this urgent debate is something like that, right? We're seeing serious human rights violations against Black people in the US and other parts of the world, ones that mean that they feel they have no domestic recourse. And, in a conversation about whether the international community should intervene, the analysis is, no, the US can handle this. There is no need for this external intervention. Everything is fine. And a universe in which that kind of analysis can hold, I think, to me, is one in which we have not yet, within the human rights regime and even within the UN, had enough reckoning with what it would take to hold countries that we think of as liberal democracies to account for grave human rights violations, including against people of African descent. It's like, if we don't see what we typically think of as an entire failed state, if a state has failed with respect to a particular population, which I think is what we're dealing with here, right? For Black people in the US, there's an aspect of their engagement with the US government that is of a kind of failed state nature. Can we ever see intervention in that space? So I'm going to leave it there. And I think the outcome of the Human Rights Council debate will resolve a lot of this. I'm eternally optimistic, much to my own, it's maybe a little bit foolish. I'm hoping that there will be strong statements made, but that's been the analysis that I've been bringing to bear on the situation. And I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and I do want to go to the Q&A. We have a number of great questions, and I also just want to acknowledge, since Tendai invoked Makau Matua, Makau Matua was one of the founders, along with Adrian Wing and Gabrielle Kirk-McDonald, of Basel. So let me group a few questions together, and I hope I can get to most of the questions, if not all. Barbara Stark asks an excellent question about what is the relationship between, here invoking Philip Alston, obscene economic equality, as Alston puts it, and structural racism? And are the global protests against both? So that issue of indivisibility that many of you touched on. Let me also just relate that to another question by, I believe, Dr. Rizwanul Islam, who asked about what is the obligation of the wealthier countries in terms of supporting marginalized communities beyond their borders in other economies. There are also a set of questions around, does the UN have adequate tools to address racism? And a question by Anna Spain Bradley regarding how we understand racism, given its link to what extent we see it as social, legal, and political reality as opposed to the biological fallacy. So let me throw that set of questions out there about race, about economic inequality, and if there's time, I'll come back to another round of questions. Who would like to start? And perhaps I could go to Mitiange, since I didn't give you as much a chance to talk about government responses.
Sure. So I can try to take a stab at that first round of questions, and then maybe even try to weave in very briefly governmental responses. I think just what I'll say about governmental responses, what has been most disheartening is just the attempt to sort of completely ally the global health regime that we've seen by many governments, including the United States. I mean, in the middle of a pandemic, the United States has decided that it's going to cease contributing to the World Health Organization, that is going to no longer affiliate with the World Health Organization, which is the organization that is responsible for coordinating the response to COVID-19, but not just COVID-19, to dealing with epidemics and pandemic disease in a number of different places. And so instead of strengthening the global health architecture at a time that it's most needed, we see a sort of return to isolationist strategies, which is incredibly problematic and challenging to deal with diseases. And then I think Professor Spain-Bradley's question I addressed already in terms of race is something that is social and legal. It's not something that sort of is based on genetics, but as a social legal construct, it has real life consequences. And so while biologically not a category that should be recognized, people's lived realities are informed by race as a category. And so I think that's how I see it. And I think that is how others see it on the panel. And then I think there was a question about sort of what is the responsibility for thinking about folks in marginalized communities, not only within one society, but beyond one society. And so I think human rights law and global health law provides for thinking about the right to health as something that's extraterritorial, meaning it's not just about obligations that you owe to your own population, but it's about what you owe elsewhere. And so I think about the right to health in that context. And so given the stark racial health inequities that we see societally and transnationally, I think that there is definitely, and I have made arguments that there is a responsibility for epidemics beyond one's borders, and that there is an obligation that societies have to correct for those, and those responsibilities are rooted in international law and international human rights law and international global health law and international law more generally, if you think about sort of some obligations to cooperate in the UN Charter and the like. And then I think there are also sort of moral and political arguments that can be made about responsibility. And then if you are thinking in a more sort of self-centered or self-interested way, I think that there are ways in which you can think about responsibility being something that is necessary, because as global warming and as we've seen with COVID-19 and globalization, it's really not sort of possible to sort of isolate yourself from things that are going on elsewhere in the world. And so whereas there is the tendency to want to protect the center is not going to hold without substantial investment in the periphery, and actually we might want to disturb the center holding because the center is a destabilizing force. And so yes, there are obligations that we owe, and those obligations are rooted in many different places.
Since we just have 6 minutes left, let me just throw out a couple other questions, and we can and give you each a chance to give final reflections about sort of where we go from here. And I think the set of questions tees that up well. One is, would targeted risk management strategies have been a better approach to managing COVID-19? Why were targeted approaches not chosen as a preferred and more practical policy and a method? Also a question about the increase in deaths of Black trans women, how to address and deal with the challenges of people who fall into more than one marginalized group. And then finally, a question by Noah Novogrodsky about how it took decades for the international community to respond to HIV/AIDS in poor and marginalized places. Can we hope for a faster funding and political response with COVID-19? Maybe if you can each take 2 minutes on those set of questions, or the earlier set, and just final thoughts. Amanda, would you like to start, and then we can go to Tendai and Matianga?
There's so much to unpack here. I think the question about an extreme inequality is tied to the extraterritorial obligations, is also tied to what a targeted approach would work, and what do we do about intersecting discrimination like trans women. And I think what we have to understand is that this is a moment where all of human rights abuses that governments have failed to address and have allowed to continue to happen have come home to roost in the context of this pandemic in so many ways. And if we think that the end of this pandemic will be the end of these challenges, I think that we're wrong on two levels. One is that the economic recovery will, without a targeted and meaningful engagement to not replicate the systems that existed prior to the pandemic, will only exacerbate them. And the second issue, and we haven't said the word yet, but we really have to think about, is climate change. So if we think this is a microcosm of how climate change will play out in a racialized and in a discriminatory way, it already is happening. And if we cannot figure out mechanisms by which we can start to address inequality and discrimination, and in particular anti-Black racism, we're going to see a slow and painful process of continued marginalization and violations and abuse. So so what does that mean? It means that extraterritorial obligations have to be employed. We have to figure out a way to make the arguments for extraterritorial obligations. We have to address extreme inequality, and that may be through tax and fiscal policies or other ways. And we have to also understand that extreme inequality is interlinked with racism. And if you think about George Floyd, we were talking about a $20 bill, and then you look at the financial crimes that are left completely in impunity around the world that leave people in greater poverty and inequality. There is absolutely at the heart of that a different response for a very targeted and specific reason. So all of that to say, I think that is both our challenge and the promise of international law, because this is a moment to get the ducks in a row, because this problem of global crises is not going away. It's only going to become more of an issue, and we need to figure out how to address it in an equitable way.
Should I go? I'll be really, really quick. So to the question on, is this about, what's the relationship between socioeconomic inequality and structural racism in these debates? Just quickly to say that they are very closely related. I think that there is a socioeconomic analysis of the situation right now that stands on its own, but it is not complete without grappling with a race analysis as well. So they're not, one does not exhaust the other, but there's absolutely an intersectionality that is being articulated in this moment. And on intersectionality and how different structures come together, the question about Black trans people, I think, speaks to how I've been heartened to see that even at the global level, there's been an attempt to try and engage with intersectionality in ways that speak to hopeful things, but who knows? And then finally, on the getting the ducks in the row that Amanda was talking about, I couldn't agree more. I think what we're experiencing in this pandemic is what kind of the transnational nature of inequality and transnational mobilizations against that inequality, and a demand for the international order and even for national orders to respond in ways that can actually solve the problem. And this, I think, brings to the fore the need to for a conversation about reparations globally, where reparations also means just undoing structures of inequality and injustice that persist to this day, and trying to think about how you repair the system and come up with one that is rooted in equal relations rather than in the kind of deep inequalities that we're seeing.
Tiange, why don't you close us out?
Well, that's a heavy responsibility, but I think I wanted to just address one question that wasn't addressed, which is regarding, whether we will see a greater mobilization of funding and political will, given what we saw with HIV and AIDS. And my concern is that as COVID-19 becomes more and more racialized, that actually the ways in which HIV and AIDS is experienced today in the United States is one that is racialized, depending on who you are and where you live. race you are, the disease is at pandemic levels, for example, in Black communities, and is one that is not seen as a manageable disease that unless you have the funds to afford, different therapies that you need to survive. And that's sort of mimics how the disease is experienced on the African continent. And so my concern with COVID-19 is that it will become increasingly racialized, and that will then render it inevitable, because the ways in which historically institutions have responded to diseases that disproportionately impact people of color has been to marginalize them and to background them. And so I am actually deeply afraid that there will not be sufficient political will and funding to deal with COVID-19 as well as other diseases where it's seen as it's affecting the periphery and not the core. And so that's a sad note to end on, but it's also sort of my deep fear. So I wish I could be more optimistic about things. And my hope is that, this moment will not repeat the sad history that we've seen in other diseases.
With deep gratitude, I want to thank the speakers and also encourage folks, if you like what you saw today, to sign up for next week's annual meeting of ASIL on June 25th and 26th. Thank you so much to our speakers.